central nervous system. Within that efferent branch, we have voluntary and we have involuntary. The autonomic branch is associated with the involuntary movements. The movement just happens automatically. In the autonomic nervous system, there are two primary subdivisions we're going to focus on today, with a third subdivision and just a couple PowerPoint slides dedicated to. It's kind of an afterthought. Now, as we think of our autonomic nervous system, I want you to think of the parts of the body that don't have glandular functions, cardiac muscle tissue, and smooth muscle tissue. Very rarely, in a few situations, we're going to have skeletal muscle included within the autonomic system. Just be associated with breathing responses. So we'll spend some time talking about some reflex arcs. So I can't emphasize this enough. Within our autonomic nervous system, we have involuntary action potentials being sent down. These are signals that are sent automatically. Now, when we use this term visceral refers to organs of the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity. So the muscular tissue within these organs are not necessarily going to depend on the autonomic nervous system for function, but they're going to depend on the autonomic nervous system for fine-tuning the function. A good example would be the carburetor of a car. Because I don't think we have a lot of grease monkeys in here. A good example would be the difference between versus inappropriately. A bonfire versus a candle. When you have a candle, that candle has very fine control of the flame. You, as the person in charge of the candle, are controlling when it burns, when it goes on, when it goes off. But if left to its own devices, fires can burn out of control. They don't need direct intervention to burn. They're just going to burn irregularly and out of control, and sometimes they'll burn themselves out. And the same when we look at these organs, these visceral organs can function without the autonomic nervous system. They just don't function as well. They're going to be prone to being overactive or underactive. We can occasionally have something known as denervation hypersensitivity. If this occurs, we're going to lose the autonomic nerves. Those autonomic nerves either are going to have a lesion within the brain that prevents the signal from being sent, or there's an injury to the body that severs the nerves. And in these situations, we're going to have a very exaggerated response. Instead of having that fine-tuned, controlled response, we typically have all the way on or all the way off, fully activated or fully deactivated. As we look at reflexes, a reflex is something that's going to happen automatically, so it's part of our autonomic nervous system. And when we look at the processing of a reflex arc, this processing of the reflex arc is almost always going to occur within the spinal cord or within the brainstem. This decision is so important. It's such an easy decision for our body to make. We don't need to use our cerebrum for it. Typically, when we look at reflex arcs, we're going to have to make a decision almost instantaneously. And we need to make this almost instantaneous decision because we're at risk of immediate and severe bodily harm. So we have the withdrawal reflex. When you're walking down the street, you step on a sharp rock or you step on a nail, you will almost instantaneously pull your foot back before you even realize what's happening. That's because the decision to do that was made in your spinal cord, and you start pulling your foot away from that rock that you're stepping on as your higher brain functions are becoming aware of the pain. Another reflex arc, the one that I decided to highlight for you, that was also highlighted in this chapter of the textbook, the baroreflexor reflex. In our bodies, we have baroreceptors. These baroreceptors measure blood pressure. And when you're lying down versus standing up, you change the pressure of your blood within your body. The baroreceptors within our body are going to function as the receptor within a generic reflex arc. They measure the blood pressure, and then they're going to send that signal to the central nervous system through afferent neurons. So we measure the blood pressure within our baroreflex. We send the signal to the central nervous system. Within the central nervous system, we have an interneuron that integrates the signal. When we say integrate, this is another word for processes the information and makes a decision. These integration neurons or interneurons of the central nervous system are almost always, in nearly every single situation, going to be a multipolar neuron. After that integrating center with the interneuron makes a decision, that decision is sent through the efferent neurons of the motor division, and then those efferent neurons are going to travel to an effector to carry out whatever that end response is. With the barrel reflex, you've probably noticed when you go from lying down and you stand up really quickly, a lot of times you get really woozy. And the dizzy, woozy feels because you have a dramatic drop in blood pressure. All of a sudden, you have a dramatic drop in blood supply to your brain. In response to that lack of blood going to your brain, your body responds by constricting the blood vessels and increasing cardiac output to increase pressure so you have enough blood go into your brain. This is a little bit beyond the scope of this class, but we as humans have pretty short necks. So we don't need to have that strong of a barrel reflex. But if you think of a giraffe, its head can alternate elevation 20 feet easily, and its barrel reflex is second to none. If it didn't have appropriate valves within its body, when it bends down, all the blood vessels within its brain should, based on just the pure physics involved, burst and rupture from massive cerebral aneurysms. But there's some secondary mechanisms within a giraffe's circulatory system to keep that from happening. As we look at the autonomic nervous system, we have the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Our sympathetic and our parasympathetic divisions are characterized as the fight or flight. So when we think of the sympathetic, I want you to think of high stress situations. Our sympathetic division is going to increase heart rate, blood pressure, airflow, blood glucose levels, et cetera, et cetera. These are going to be associated with situations where we either need to have a lot of physical activity or we may have a lot of physical activity. The new school term or analogy for the sympathetic nervous system is fight, flight, or freeze. Because a lot of people can still be really stressed out, but then they kind of freeze up and their sympathetic nervous system is activated even though they aren't running away or fighting. You could think of the freeze component as maybe testing anxiety. That would be a good analogy for the fight, flight, or freeze. When we think of the parasympathetic division, our parasympathetic division is typically going to be known as the rest and digest division of the nervous system. It's going to be associated with rerouting blood to the visceral organs, and it's going to help us have maintenance of our bodies. And when we look at the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, they work at the same time with each other. There are times in our lives where we need to be stressed out. It's good for us to be stressed out. There are other times in our lives where it's good for us to relax and repair our tissues. And we go back and forth with this many times throughout the day. Sometimes we'll have both systems working at the same time. Generally speaking, though, our sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions will have contrasting effects on a given organ system. As a rule of thumb, they have opposite effects to each other. One of the things that's regulated in the autonomic nervous system is autonomic tone. This autonomic tone is general background activity of both the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. So they're both going to be active at the same time. For the parasympathetic tone, with the digestive tract, have constant smooth muscle contractions within our digestive tract. This will keep chyme or food and feces moving through our digestive tract constantly. I remember a couple years ago, I shared an office with a woman who had a very stressed out daughter. She was a triple major. She was economics, music, and pre-med. And she was pulling a 3.9 GPA. And a 3 athlete student as well. I mean, this young lady was just insane. And she was so stressed out all the time that her sympathetic nervous system was completely overpowering her parasympathetic nervous system. And she was losing that parasympathetic tone within her digestive tract. She was having a terrible abdominal pain because she wasn't pushing her feces through her abdominal tract or her digestive tract. And she had to go to counseling with electrodes hooked up to her digestive tract where they basically taught her how to chill out so that she could pass feces. It's important that we have both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems working at the same time. When we think of sympathetic tone, the sympathetic branch of our nervous system is going to be primarily associated with that background constriction of our muscles within our blood vessels. And these smooth muscles need to contract to increase our blood pressure so that our brain has adequate blood supply. We also use blood pressure to help regulate the filtration of blood. Next semester, we'll go all over renal filtration within the glomerulus of the kidney. It's one of those topics. We'll get to it next semester. The tone of the blood vessels is a very important key component of renal filtration. So let's talk about the pathways. Our autonomic pathways are typically going to have multiple neurons involved. When we think of a general somatic or motor or voluntary pathway, it's typically the motor neuron from the spinal cord going directly to the skeletal muscle. The skeletal muscle is activated by acetylcholine. This is your somatic or voluntary pathway. One motor neuron to one skeletal muscle secreting acetylcholine for a neurotransmitter. Within our autonomic pathway, one neuron, we're going to have two neurons. The neuron, we're going to have a ganglion, or the synapse, occur at different locations. When we look at the sympathetic nervous system, we're going to have the motor neuron, synapse, with a ganglion separate from the organ. So we have a very short preganglionic fiber and then a long postganglionic fiber going directly to the organ. Within the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, the preganglionic fiber, the fiber or the nerve fiber before the synapse, is really, really long. And then within the parasympathetic nervous system, the ganglion is almost at the organ itself. And then from there, we have a very short post-ganglion nerve fiber. Within the sympathetic division, those ganglion fibers are really close to the spinal cord. And this is one of the lab objectives that you had to learn during lab, the sympathetic trunk ganglion. Or if you're old school, it was the sympathetic chain ganglion. And the sympathetic trunk ganglion is a ring of ganglionic fiber, or ganglion, that's lateral to our spinal cord. So as we look at the sympathetic chain ganglion, or trunk ganglion, we have ganglion located within a chain, connected by various nerves that go superior and inferior, and then medial, lateral, and anterior and posterior. These ganglion, the sympathetic chain of ganglion, is going to have nerve fibers traveling in all directions. These sympathetic chain of ganglion are essential for the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. As we look at the sympathetic root ganglion or chain ganglion, they are going to have some special branches known as communicating rami, or rami. These communicating rami are going to help to interlink multiple ganglion. As we look at the preganglionic fiber, the preganglionic fiber is going to be the axon of the neuron that leaves the spinal cord. So within the sympathetic division, we have the lateral branch or lateral horn of the gray matter. This lateral horn of the gray matter is where the neurosoma of these neurons is located. And then they'll send their nerve fibers or their axons to the ganglia. And then from that ganglia, there'll be a synapse, and then the new neuron will send the signal away with a postganglion fiber. Something that's worth emphasizing with the sympathetic postganglionic fibers is that they are unmyelinated fibers. In other words, these fibers travel very slowly, or have their action potentials travel relatively slowly compared to those thick myelinated fibers. As we look at these postganglionic fibers, some of them will head superiorly or inferiorly to another ganglion. Some of them are going to head to a separate branch of ganglion. And then some of these fibers are just going to go directly to the organ in question. They can travel multiple different directions. As we're looking at them, those fibers that end with the ganglion enter the synapse immediately above or below the postganglionic neuron are shown, let's clear the screen here, are shown right here. So we have the fiber going up or the fiber going down. Excuse me, that was number 2. Fibers traveling up or down. Number 1 on this slide is represented by the nerve fiber going directly from the ganglia back out and then to the target organ. Number 2 on the next slide is represented by nerve fibers going to a superior or an inferiorly located ganglia. Number 3 is a little bit trickier though. Sometimes those fibers are going to go to a different ganglion. They'll go through the sympathetic chain ganglion without a synapse and then continue as a splenic nerve. So the preganglionic fiber will travel, let me clear the slide for us here. The preganglionic fiber is going to travel all the way through the sympathetic chain ganglion and continue as a splenic nerve to a secondary ganglion that it will then synapse with. So depending on the direction of that nerve, we're going to influence what organs are innervated. Sometimes they go up, sometimes they go down, sometimes they go directly to the organ, sometimes they go to a secondary ganglion. Let's talk parasympathetic. As we look at our parasympathetic nervous system, our parasympathetic nervous system has very long preganglionic neurons. To back up a couple slides here, within the parasympathetic nervous system, to emphasize it again, the motor neuron is located here and will have its ganglion or its fiber travel all the way nearly to the organ, and at that target organ, there'll be another ganglion that it synapses at. It looks like I skipped the adrenal glands here. Let's talk about the adrenal glands before I go to the parasympathetic nervous system. As we look at our adrenal glands are the tufer glands. We have the adrenal cortex, and we have the adrenal medulla. Our adrenal gland is both an endocrine gland, or it can be considered 2 different endocrine glands. One of them is going to be controlled directly by hormones. The other one is going to be controlled by the nervous system. In particular, when we look at the adrenal medulla is going to be controlled by our nervous system. So we're going to send sympathetic fibers directly to our adrenal medulla. And once those sympathetic fibers get to our adrenal medulla, they are going to synapse with the ganglion within the adrenal medulla. Within our adrenal medulla, that acetylcholine that's released is going to activate the hormone functions, and there'll be a category of hormones known as the catecholamines. I want you to focus on the fact that this is a generic cocktail or a generic name that refers to the adrenaline and noradrenaline, also known as the epinephrine and norepinephrine being released. Our adrenal medulla is going to be associated with our stress responses. When we activate the adrenal medulla, we are going to release these hormones into our bloodstream and activate a lot of our sympathetic responses throughout our body. Now let's talk parasympathetic. So as we look at our parasympathetic division, we have very long preganglionic fibers. Those fibers are going to travel nearly the entire length to the target organ, and right before they reach the target organ, there's a ganglion that they'll synapse at. These parasympathetic fibers or nerves are typically going to have their neurons originate within the brain or within the spinal cord. Within the spinal cord, it'll be the very inferior margins of our spinal cord, within the sacral divisions of our spinal cord, that those fibers come from. So as we look at our parasympathetic division, Our parasympathetic division will have its nerve fibers come from the brainstem or the sacral division of our spinal cord. We don't have a sympathetic root ganglion laterally linked to the spinal cord like the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system does. As we look at this parasympathetic division, we have pretty selective stimulation of the target organ. The sympathetic division of the nervous system has very broad stimulation of the target organ. And we back up a couple slides. This will make perfect sense. When we activate the sympathetic division of the nervous system, we release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. And that epinephrine and norepinephrine travel to all the tissues of the body because all the tissues of the body are associated with the bloodstream. Our sympathetic division has very widespread effects on our body. On the other hand, because our parasympathetic division doesn't have a hormone associated with it, we have very targeted activation with our parasympathetic division. Another reason why we have very targeted activation with our parasympathetic division is that we don't have those ganglion. That sympathetic chain ganglion or root ganglion is going to allow for a lot of branching of the fibers, branching of the signal. Within our sympathetic division, the relative lack of ganglion means that we're going to have the signal travel within a relatively straight line to its target organ. Some key nerves associated with the parasympathetic division include cranial nerve number 3, which narrows our pupils and focuses our lens. Cranial nerve number 7, which just focuses on activation of glandular secretion of the face. Our glossopharyngeal nerve number 9, which focuses on activating the largest salivary gland, our parotid gland. And then the vagus nerve, which is shown right here, that travels to most of those organs of the abdominal pelvic cavity. So all those organs I just circled in red are innervated by our vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10. And then finally, we have the enteric nervous system. Our enteric nervous system sometimes is categorized with the parasympathetic nervous system. Sometimes it stands alone as a third division of the autonomic nervous system. There's still debate on this one. This is something that controls our digestive tract. It's going to focus on innervating the smooth muscle and the glandular secretions of our digestive tract. We have two separate plexi associated with the enteric nervous system. These plexi are going to be located within the submucosal tissue and we use our enteric nervous system to make sure that we move substances through our digestive tract and that we process those substances appropriately. And then finally, we have a review question. The autonomic nervous system controls all the following except for what? The adrenal glands, smooth muscles within the walls of the aorta, cardiac muscle in the right atrium, skeletal muscle within the erectus abdominis, or the parotid salivary gland. Which of the following is not controlled by our involuntary branch of our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system? We're down to about 20 seconds. Make sure you get your answers in. The correct answer was the skeletal muscle tissue. We typically have voluntary control of our skeletal muscle tissue. Have a great Friday.